This presentation, this PowerPoint, we first presented it at the recent VFF Connects conference, and that was about a month and a half ago. It was received very well. Lots of coordinators have been asking us to share the PowerPoint, which we will be in due course. And but we decided that it would be good for a part of this winter series to present it to anybody in VFF across the country in a simple webinar format. So that's what we're going to do. There are 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We're going to go through each one, translate them into plain language, what they actually mean, because they're worded in really nice ways, but what they actually mean is not so nice. So we're going to translate them, and then we're going to provide examples and further explanations of how those specific goals are being implemented in New Zealand.
Right. And before we go on, there's one thing I'd like to make clear, that regardless of whether you think that the United Nations is, a wonderful organization, or whether you do not, our point here is that this is an unelected, unappointed, unaccountable body. It's handy that its alias is UN, and that's where the problem lies. That most of these goals are being directed by an organization that, right, do this, do this, do this. And the outcomes are not quite what we expect. But then the body that is telling us to do so, or are telling our parliamentarians, our legislator to do so, was never actually elected by us. It doesn't answer to us. And that's where the issue lies with the United Nations SDGs. So this one is from 2019. Jacinda Ardern spoke in New York on this forum called the Goalkeepers, hosted by the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates. And this is just a short excerpt of what she said at that point, that why are we doing this?
So to tackle these issues in New Zealand, the government I'm proud to lead is doing something not many other countries have tried. We've incorporated the principles of the 2030 Agenda into our domestic policy making in a way that we hope will drive system-level actions. This is not just a new scorecard. It is about fundamentally changing how we make decisions and therefore how we allocate resources. For instance, when deciding where to spend public money and manage our national assets, we've decided it's no longer enough to ask what will drive economic growth. Now the question that we as politicians are asking is, what will do the most to improve both the lives of New Zealanders now, but also in the future? Now, to help us answer that question, in New Zealand, we've been having our Treasury developing what's called a living standards framework that measures well-being, it measures risk, it measures resilience across economic, social, and environmental domains. It puts sustainable intergenerational well-being at the heart of our decision-making, not just economic growth.
Right. And that was 2019. So we have also been seeing a report card by our government being published for the United Nations in the form of the People's Report on stt.org.nz. If you go into more detail on this one, you see a full group of organizations, a whole lot, right from a Human Rights Commission to different banks to various non-governmental organizations, all pledging their support for fulfilling the criteria of the SDG. But somehow no one seems to be taking any responsibility for the outcomes. We see the same basis of these SDGs being pushed in the Waikato Wellbeing Project. And it's no surprise that the 20-minute cities and so on have begun with the real push in that area. We also see the SDGs being pushed by different councils. And again, as Tane said, they appear to be in really nice language, but not a lot of the fallout is being looked at, whether it is good for New Zealanders, whether we wanted this or not. This is a quote by Maurice Strong, one of the first, I think he was second or the third Secretary General of the United Nations. And keep in mind, this was nearly 4 decades ago now, where their issue was the current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent, meat intake, fossil fuels, air conditioning, suburban housing, all of those are not sustainable. 30, 40 years back. And I don't know what they deem as affluent, but it seems that the ordinary people are the ones that are bearing the brunt of these. The sdg.org.nz website lets you know that which ones of the plans currently being undertaken by different councils reflect the SDGs, actually. We might think, all right, thriving city centers or more bike lanes or yet another bridge or fewer cars or houses without any more parking lots are for us, but they might be. Some of you might agree, but most of them are fulfilling the different SDGs. Tane?
Right, yes, we'll start off goal number 1, to end poverty in all its forms everywhere, which sounds great. Translation, put everyone on government welfare, housing subsidies, food stamps, handouts that keep people obedient. Never allow people upward mobility. You can have an equal level all down at the bottom. We can all be equal at the bottom. And it lends to this idea of a universal basic income, which we'll see in one of the next few slides.
But how well has this translated? Because we've had a government constantly telling us child poverty, they are now even classifying poverty by ethnicity. But yet, 5 years later, this is 1st May 2023, we still have 1 in 5 kids living under conditions of food insecurity in what is supposed to be a first world country, in what is one of the biggest food producing countries of the world. And home ownership, how much have we heard about capital gains tax, wealth tax, landlords against tenants, and healthy home standards and whatnot. And yet we are at the stage where we are having the lowest rate of home ownership, and especially first home buyers have virtually left the market. But yeah, here we are ticking off those goals. And it's become so bad that we are now slowly, the narrative is being pushed that, our welfare state has really become massive, and it's a mammoth now, and that the money currently being spent on targeted transfer payments could easily fund a UBI, a universal basic income. And what is a universal basic income? It is, again, complete and utter dependence on the state.
Goal number 2, end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and the promotion of sustainable agriculture. And what has that actually meant over the past few decades? GMOs, Monsanto's patented seeds, while increasing the use of deadly herbicides, genetically modified plants that boost specific vitamins and chemicals while having no idea of the long-term consequences. And we see this, it might not be in the slide, but just recently, one of the political parties has pledged to ease the laws on GE in New Zealand. Isn't that right, Jaspreet?
Yep. And again, all one asks for is an open debate. There are pros and cons of everything. But what is now being pushed as sustainable? That's the question. We have been pushed into the whole regenerative debate in farming. And I see it around me all the time. So what is the opposite of that? Is it degenerative if I'm not a regenerative farmer? MPI, the regenerative agricultural journey, so far has cost us $57.74 million. And they have set up a technical advisory group tag. They had a COVID tag, a technical advisory group as well, which was set up to help define what regenerative agriculture means. So we have spent tens of millions of dollars on something for which we still don't have a specific definition, but yet the same word regenerative appears on the World Economic Forum and UN website. And this is what sustainable agriculture is. This is a farm next door to our property in Tuatapere, now being converted into pines. And next year, and IKEA has bought so many farms in New Zealand. And next year, when the big IKEA mall opens in Auckland, it will be pushed as sustainable Nordic furniture. And yet, what is the cost of this? We've had scientists, very prominent MIT ones, including Tom Sheehan, pictured here. His tour, he just finished a fortnight back, who have proven with the science that methane does not matter in global warming. It is water vapor. But no, we as a country are so keen to step into where angels fear to tread. We are the first ones to start taxing emissions behind the farm gate now. And where is that money going to go? What is it going to achieve? That's all up in the air.
And here we have the consequences of this new carbon industry. Some of our greatest historic farms and stations around New Zealand are being transitioned into pine forests, foreign-owned ones as well.
New Zealand to Newfoundland, literally. But we've reached a stage where everything native is holier than thou, and yet the exotic pine seems to take a place of pride here.
Yeah, that's an interesting contradiction. That's a good one to point out.
Just this week, this is an article that had come, and most people have missed the significance of this. We have signed an agreement with the EU, which the government says is going to give us, close to $100 million worth of benefit in terms of tariff reduction, and of course, a multi-billion-dollar trade there. But this trade deal is a financial straitjacket at this point. It has everything from gender equality to sustainability and so on, fulfilling our, undertakings to the Paris Accord and so on. And yet they tell us that these unelected bodies have no role in New Zealand. They have absolutely no impact. And we are changing our very legislation to put these into, every single thing we do. The Aussie farmers across the ditch are far wiser. They don't want to have a bar of it, but we don't seem to have even an opposition of any sort now. It is just like full steam ahead.
So, sorry if anyone's eating while watching this, but that's the, yeah. And there's more.
Yeah, there's a whole lot more where this comes from. Otago University research is not quite appetizing, but hey, it might take your fancy.
Goal number 3, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. And where has that led us? In the last few years, there's been a bit of mandatory medicine and mandatory testing in some cases. We're now seeing fluoridation being forced on councils around New Zealand.
And is it at Ashley Bloomfield now, who's the one in charge of this, the mass fluoridation?
No, he's moved. Oh, you mean at the overseas?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's now number 2 in the World Health Organization as well. And many people, I'm not sure, I think they miss out the fact that the World Health Organization is an agency of United Nations. They work in sync. The face of Tedros throughout the pandemic was also the face of United Nations at the same time. They are not different at all. And
if you just go back to that slide, Jaspreet, one back, there's actually a whole list of specialized agencies that belong to the United Nations. It's not obviously not just the WHO. And again, they're all influencing how our countries are governed, but we don't have any say on who has those positions in those organizations.
UNICEF, UNESCO, you name it, and all of them, be it in your education system, health, and restricting your autonomy or restricting even our ability to produce food, feed ourselves. It is all coming by this one same organization that we did not elect. We did not elect them.
Goal number 4, ensuring inclusive, equitable, quality education, promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. We know that New Zealand's got a great education system. Not. Pushing a false history, a dumbed-down education system, education standards that produce an obedient workers rather than independent thinkers. Here's an important quote to remember. This is from Lenin, one of the famous communists. Give me 4 years to teach the children, and the seed I've sown will never be uprooted. So it's part of why people are flocking to homeschooling to get their kids away from the indoctrination, but that's obviously not an option for everyone, and which is why we as a movement need to regain control of what children are being taught in the schools that our tax dollars pay for.
Exactly. Now, the international reading literature standards, these ones that come out, we were at once at the top of this rankings. And last year, our year 5 placed last among all the English-speaking countries. and 24th out of 26 of all the participating OECD countries. So the education system is not something to be proud of. It was once, but at this point, by all the indicators that we are seeing, vis-a-vis other countries, heck, even Russia has overtaken us. It is, I think, now number 2 or number 3 in reading, and we are way below that. You have literally dictatorships that are ahead of us, and our own children are slipping down this. This is from and so what are they being taught right now? This is from the Ministry of Education's website. And they talk about strengthening Kaupapa Maori to support a cultural shift in education, building critical consciousness to support that cultural shift. And that means taking anti-oppressive action to do something, recognizing white privilege, understanding racism, inequity faced by Maori, and disrupting that status quo to strengthen equity. Whither are the 3 R's, which is for which most parents used to send their children to school? They are not out there to become activists. Their job at this point is to read, write, and be able to be, good members of the society, productive members of the society. But this is what is right now being taught. And the whole racism issue, I saw it out here in one of our local drags when we had, and I mentioned it on one of the UN webinars, we had a 14-year-old child write in a local periodical here, sent on the West Coast, this Western Southland area, that she faces racism because she cannot get Band-Aid the right color to match her skin in the local Foursquare. And I was horrified to see that that is what is perceived as racism by a 14-year-old. And that essay was graded highly, got a merit score, and that's why it was republished in our local periodical. But again, yes, Tane.
And the irony is that they say they're against racism, but they're actually being racist. Because when in the school system, when they're talking to children, white children, there's the demonization. It's all you're a descendant of a colonizer. You are from the oppressor's side. These are the victims. They're pushing what they claim to be in opposition to.
But it is no surprise that that's being pushed, because that's what's being pushed by the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. That's what the United Nations wants. And the way I see it is it's the age-old divide and rule. Divide and rule keep us busy infighting, whereas the agenda just keeps marching on in the background. This caught my attention last week. It said South Asian high school students are increasingly standing up to champion better race relations in New Zealand. 7 out of the 22 semifinalists who spoke at the Race Unity Speech Awards ceremony in June were Indian, Southeast Asian. That's really odd, those sort of statistics. If a third of the people who are saying that the place is racist are Indian. I have sort of become, in my community, I've often spoken up with the diaspora here, and I often ask the same question. So where is the racism? Where is it? I'm not saying that there is none, but to say that that is the only thing, it seems to be a perpetual topic of discussion. There's not a single day that the media doesn't throw something in there to, set aflame emotions yet again. And I've seen this in India growing up, pitting us again, on the basis of religion. And since, as I see it, religion is not that big in New Zealand, the amount of melanin in your skin, that becomes the next best thing to exploit, doesn't it, Tane?
Yeah, it seems to be.
Yeah, and we had our own government last year. First, they said that, your white privilege is not being taught, and then, okay, it is there, it is a theme, but it's not a part of the curriculum. Whatever this word salad means, it is definitely being taught. You don't have to teach that stuff. I mean, when you can't even manage the basics of reading, writing, and have kids with such slipping scores, it is not your job to create activists, or maybe I'm just showing my age when I say that. This is another example. So, everything is, we are talking about refugees and migrants, and I'm a migrant myself. I don't take this lightly when I say this. But we had the Iranian MP, Golruz Garuman, really lobby for Behrouz Boochani to be granted refugee status. This was during the height of the COVID pandemic. Behrouz, he had been on the Manus Island in Australia. They had been imprisoned there for a while, and he'd written a book, a whole text, which he sent out via WhatsApp that became a bestseller. So he came to New Zealand, was granted residency here. He is now, I believe, a professor of some stature. And within a short while, we have these the migrants who just stepped ashore not long ago are now talking of decolonization. I wonder how quickly that switch happens. Or are we using people? Are these people being used without realizing what is going on? That's the way I think. But
yeah, well, it's a trend not just in New Zealand. It's a global trend in all the new world countries. You've got it happening in Australia as well, and in the United States too.
The UN is now asking for schools for people with disabilities to be closed, saying that, it's not inclusive. And I'm glad so far that the government seems to be standing strong against that one dictate coming down from these globalists. But why should the UN even have a say in what New Zealand schools do? But the UN is saying, the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities, that develop a comprehensive institutionalization strategy, redirect funding and resources into inclusive education system, and take measures to cease investment in residential specialist schools for children with disabilities. That is galling. They have absolutely no business to have any say at all. And one has to give credit to the government. They haven't buckled yet. But I know somebody who is on the spectrum and who is in one of the specialist Christchurch schools. This person has really picked up well since being there over the last year. But the parents, who are friends of mine, are being told by the teachers there that they are not sure how long they have a space for this teenager for, because these schools are up in a limbo. And that is, again, the United Nations doing. So much for inclusive education. There must be many teachers here. And how disruptive is it for you? You're already stretched trying to manage children. I honestly teach my own children. Hats off to teachers for doing it at, a classroom full day after day. And if you have one child of high needs, how are you going to do justice to the rest? This is not a matter of institutionalization or not. It's just providing, resources. But yet, even there is a globalist demand of what sovereign nations should be doing. Tane.
Oh, you can handle this one, Jaspreet.
So gender equality. And we seem to be talking about this all the time. And, we had Kelly Jakeen come here, Posey Parker, and stand up for women. And whatever happened to that march that didn't even happen, all she was trying to do was to speak up. And yet we didn't do any of that. The mob turned violent in Auckland. But a couple of years ago, if you look back, the United Nations was talking about banning conversion therapies. Again, New Zealand said, yep, we will do that. Shanil Lal, who this year is the Kiwi Bank New Zealander of the Year, was spearheading that group that lobbied for this. United Nations asked, we delivered, and which is fine. Don't get me wrong. I am not in favor of conversion therapy at all. Everyone for himself. But why did we need to pass this law in February 2022? Because under the Official Information Act, we had no proof that this was actually happening. There was one informal complaint to the Human Rights Commission over the past 10 years, and yet we chose to set up a $2.2 million worth of taxpayer-funded complaint center to receive complaints about conversion therapy. And the center later admitted that there have been no formal complaints since a new law was passed, despite significantly advertising about its services. I hope it advertised. $2.2 million is a pretty penny. But it's almost like we look for solutions for non-existing problems here. So was this just for virtue signaling, another tick box there? We did not need this, and yet we passed this. And I shudder to think how much the whole cost of, legislation passing is not cheap. There is consultants, there's consultations of at different levels and so on. There is parliamentary debate time. And we did all of this for nothing. I don't know. So am I going? And this is the Ministry of Education's detail on how LGBTQIA students should be managed, designing respectful transition approaches and so on. And I don't have an issue with it. For me, the issue is, number one, it should be parents. A child's first port of call for any of this should be their parents. This is not the state's domain here to be stepping into, what should be a private matter between parents and children. And the whole really blowing up the issue. We saw so much media narrative, which I shook my head at after the Posey Parker debacle in Auckland, saying that, I think Shanil Lal got breakfast slot also, didn't he, Tane? Saying that, that he was terrified for his life, but still going. Why are we down this path? We are already, we've had marriage equality for a long time. Homosexuality or anything has never been an issue. I barely know anyone who bats an eyelid. And yet here we are spending millions and millions for yet another tick box exercise.
Goal number 6, ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. So this is where 3 waters, or is it 5 waters, or is it more now, comes into play in New Zealand. Allow powerful corporations to seize control of the world's water supplies and charge monopoly prices. Here's an important quote from former Vice President of the World Bank. If the wars of this century, he's talking in the 1980s, I believe, were fought over oil, the wars of the next century will be fought over water, unless we change our approach to managing this precious and vital resource. And New Zealand is blessed with, abundant freshwater supplies, and people or countries that look at that from overseas that are stronger than us militarily are looking to take advantage of that. And in many cases, that's already happened in New Zealand with foreign ownership of various water bottling plants and things like that.
And it's amazing how quickly one Havelock North contamination in a council facility, council water reservoir, turned into 3 waters. And then first it was for our health, then no, it was for co-governance, then it was for equity. And it has just gone on and on. And at one point, for about, I think it was $120 billion worth of assets, ratepayers were going to get about $2.5 billion. Well, quietly, in April, the government said the second round of the better off funding that many councils were counting on has been taken away. And in the same breath, they announced, but the new water regulator and the different entities, I believe it's 10, that need to set up, they need an extra billion or maybe 2. So yeah, that just got canned. And where this goes is anyone's guess, but hopefully there is no one here yet who still thinks this is to get you, a rebate on your water bills 30 years from today. We are also, yet again, and you will notice this theme, world first methane tax. Now, this is a world first, developing a world's first nationally contiguous set of maps for groundwater age, origin, and flow paths. So we have set up a program, a pioneering program, to map all our groundwater now, aquifers, and so on. And they say there is many national and international collaborators involved in mapping this. I wonder how we've survived so far. In its very essence, the Sustainable Development Goals, or Agenda 21 or Agenda 2030, whatever you call it, is census of every single resource that's available. Every single resource. You have, land, water, everything, and then control of it. And well, you can't just have, groundwater freely available, can you? Everything is being mapped right now.
Goal number 7, to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. And what this actually means, penalising coal, gas, oil, traditional forms of energy that empower, in particular, Western countries, while pushing green energy subsidies for the new wind and other forms, which are less efficient than solar.
Yep, which are definitely less efficient, far more expensive. We are pushing projects like the battery project in Central Otago, billions. Who is going to pay the price? And yet, on the other hand, it's the average person, average Kiwi today, who's feeling the pinch at the grocery till, who's feeling the pinch of power bills, especially as winter hits now. They are paying the bills for this. Light Force, it is saying that, because they're probably going to be partnering with the social housing. So all social housing projects will now get funded solar panels. We have used $140 million of ratepayer money, taxpayer money, to subsidize NZ Steel. Its parent company in Australia last year had a profit of well over $1 billion. Why are New Zealand taxpayers paying for decarbonization and all of this right now? It is literally a wealth transfer happening. The ordinary Kiwi is bearing the brunt. And if we've seen what's happened in UK, US, Germany last winter in the Northern Hemisphere, where the grids failed and the costs were absolutely astronomical, we can see where we are headed. We are lucky as it is as a country in a way that a large energy is renewable, but pushing us to go the extra mile for now towards the very end it is very, very expensive and very inefficient forms of energy that they're now pushing. We had John Nicholson and I on Greenwashed, had Ian Plimer on last month. And Ian said something that struck with me. He said, civilization has progressed one coal-fired plant at a time. And this graph shows you that China and India know it. China and India know it. That's where today 80 to 90% of the world's coal-powered plants are being established, because they can't afford to have billions on the street without heating and a source of fuel to cook on. But the West at this point seems to be hell-bent upon cannibalizing itself.
Yeah, and just before we move into Goal 8, the other point to make is this ties in with the Marsden Point situation and the transition that they're trying to push towards electric cars. So eventually, if we keep handicapping ourselves and saying, oh, oil's bad, that means less people can drive, less independent transport, more limited movement, etc., and then you start to see how it all fits into the bigger picture.
And that's
Goal number 8.
This is, isn't it? It's so many different pieces that it's one gets tunnel vision looking at just one aspect. But this, I have grudging admiration for this. This is a plan to control our whole lives, cradle to grave, every single aspect of it. Goal number 8, sustained inclusive growth.
Promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. In this case, it's relating to regulations, which disproportionately negatively affect small businesses. Hiring quotas, so DIE, specifically change the acronym, not DEI, DIE, because it spells something different: diversity, inclusion, and equity. That's part of the ESG framework. And let's move into some examples.
ESG is your factors when they're wanting you to look at environmental, social, and governance factors. You're looking beyond the financial balance sheet of any company. So anyone who's been following the Budweiser Light fiasco, Dylan Mulvaney in the US, that's a classic example. You see them because they have to do it because there's a corporate equality index in the US. And if you don't have those sort of acts fronting these these big brands, they don't get the funding. So literally, the banks are further inside the same thing, pushing these things, these, how do I call it, this virtue signaling. But that virtue signal is those corporates have to go through the motions of doing it, because otherwise, for lack of a better word, they are screwed.
It's a box ticking exercise in a way.
So sustainable and equitable growth and work and jobs. So we'll have, this is Taranaki 2050, talking about, once we transition, what sort of jobs will there be? We'll have meaningful jobs in low emissions energies by 2050, which work towards a community well-being and intergenerational prosperity. And what is meaningful work? They say it is defined by standards such as the United Nations and the International Labor Organization's definition of decent work. So we have our government right now trying to push modern anti-slavery laws. Go back to what we spoke about, the fact that the conversion therapy ban, we had no cases of that, but yet we pushed for a law because, hey, that's another box ticked off in the 17 SDGs. Of course, there is going to be bad employers in every industry, but we are right now pushing an anti-slavery legislation here. Meanwhile, despite its poor human rights accord, nothing seems to stop Qatar. Nothing seems to stop Qatar being on any panel. And there's places like New Zealand, which are known for their, great work-life balance and inclusive workplaces, good labor practices, that are saying, hey, we need to do more. We need to do more here. And talking of Qatar, last year, they hosted the FIFA World Cup last November. Our media missed this. Qatar, we had ministers, members of the European Parliament, including the Greek MEP, Eva Kaili. She was the vice president of the EU Parliament that time. We had others who were all caught taking cash, allegedly, in return for praising Qatar early last year about its work practices and its gender equality and all of that, because, hey, this country was going to hold the FIFA World Cup and you could not have any sort of, bad reputation about it in public. So these countries get a free pass, but yet New Zealand must pass anti-slavery legislation. Tane.
Goal number 9, building resilient infrastructure, promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Putting nations into extreme debt with the World Bank, spending debt money to hire corrupt corporations to build large-scale infrastructure projects that trap developing nations in an endless spiral of debt.
That is pretty self-explanatory. As anyone who's seen, our debt is at what, 73 billion increased in the last few years. Those printing presses never seem to stop. And yet, when we talk about what sort of, inclusive growth and industrialization is happening, we are creating at this point concrete jungles, paying millions and billions for it. A classic example is the Let's Get Wellington Moving project. That began at, I think it was about $5 billion, went up to 6.4. Last week's figures quoted, they say because of the inflation, it's now at $7.5 billion to get Wellington, they used to call it the coolest little capital in the world, get it moving. I don't know whatever had happened to it, but can we afford this? It's almost like no one cares. We just seem to keep pressing go on all of these projects. And I like this meme.
Yeah, it's made by a great guy. The Twitter handle @Rustifer if you want to see his other memes.
Yeah. So people in Hamilton, I think there was this bit of news in the media when they went to a town hall about the 20-minute city and what's happening. It's almost like we don't seem to see what's happening in the UK and the pushback there, that people do not want these. They are called by different names in the US. I think Sajid Khan called them ULEZ, ultra low emission zones. Then there are safer streets, there are quiet streets. There's quaint little differences in different countries about what they call them. The end goal is the same. In New Zealand, now there's this Sustainable Cities Center. Now, when I look at it, this is again somebody not appointed, not elected, an NGO working within New Zealand. If something is to be done, it should be done by your center government or by your local governments with full transparency, full engagement. And yet we have research and professors going on here talking about what the future of our cities is going to look like. How did we even get here?
Reducing inequality within and among countries, create equality by bringing everyone down to the lowest common denominator, give everyone third world living standards to achieve equality.
And we've spoken so much about equity and equality, haven't we? And yet during the lockdowns, and we've spoken so much about sovereignty and forgive me if I get the pronunciation wrong. Is it Tino Rangatiritanga? And
Senoranga,
yep. So we spoke about this for the Maori, and yet it was Northland that got some of the worst of the lockdowns, the hardest borders. The push for Maori and Pacifica to get a vaccine has been the strongest amongst all the demographics I have seen. And what has happened while the rest of the countries kept infighting? And you hear people talking about, oh, Maoris are getting everything. I'm often at pains to point out that let us please distinguish between Iwi and Maori. Much of the benefit, if I speak to my Maori mates, the benefit doesn't make it down to the bottom. It stops at the top. And there's very little I agree with Bernard Hickey, but this I do. There's been the greatest wealth transfer ever in our lifetimes, I think in the past 2 or 3 generations, as has happened during COVID. And it will keep happening as we keep pushing these green policies. It almost seems like the middle class is being destroyed. There's 2 classes being left, the upper class or plebes, nothing in between. And was that the affluent middle class that Maurice Strong, the United Nations Secretary General, said that 20, 30 years ago, that their eating patterns and their cars and their air conditioning is not sustainable? Who's to say? I think so. Tane.
Goal number 11, making cities and human settlements. Human settlements, a really weird way of writing it. Inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Always got to have the word sustainable in there. And this is where smart cities and 15-minute cities and 20-minute cities come into play in this presentation.
Yeah.
Herding humans into densely packed cities that are under surveillance and subject to easy manipulation. Lowering speed limits, we see that already, 30-kilometer-per-hour zones. Removing car parks because, we don't need oil. We're going to have a few electric cars, and pushing public transport, congestion charges, planter boxes. Those annoying planter boxes if you've been in Queen Street recently, not just in Auckland, but in some of the cities around New Zealand.
Yeah. Smart cities, and this one is from Canterbury, I believe, when this said that we are rethinking right after the Christchurch earthquake that how the smart city model could be used, and talking about how they used it for Christchurch and they can use it for Wellington. Ultimately, human-centered system development. And I don't know, all these terms to me, they're just a word salad, human-centric and all of this. How about just places that we all like to live in? We have become the first country, again, yet another world first methane tax, first groundwater mapping, first nation to have every single council join the Smart Cities program. And this also happened during COVID. So there's an organization called the ALGIM or ALGIM. It's the Association of Local Government Information Managers. So it did a tie-up with your Smart City Networks, Australia and New Zealand. And all the councils have been signed up to this. What this means is anyone's guess. I couldn't tell you today what it means. But looking at the Smart City Code of Australia and New Zealand that was released in 2018, it's his website talking of smart lighting, stuff that can be retrofitted with the devices that can garner data. And it's always, for safer and better decision making. It's always for your safety, isn't it? Always for your safety.
They've already been chipping away at it with things like those annoying bright white LED lights that they're slowly getting around to all the streets. Goal number 12, ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. So this is where you got to stop eating those steaks because it's destroying the planet. Even if it makes you healthy, you can't do that. begin levying punitive taxes on the consumption of fossil fuels and electricity. We're already seeing things like that. Forcing people to live under conditions of worsening standards. Use social influence campaigns in TV, movies, and social media to shame people who use petrol.
And we've seen
Conversion of
that.
farmland to forestry.
So,
Decreasing animal protein consumption. Restricting limits on sales of raw milk. We've already seen cases where farmers being persecuted for selling that, even if they follow all the proper procedures. Restrictions on access to land for hunting. Restrictions on fishing.
I wonder how many people have died or gotten sick because of raw milk in New Zealand. I can tell you that in India, where it would, and I'm not saying that's best practice, but where the milkman would probably reach you by midday, and God knows when the milk had been, when the cow had been milked. I don't know if anyone was fallen sick, but yeah, we seem to not like people having independence. But in any case, so we are unique among the world that a third of our population lives in one city, 1.7 million people, all in Auckland. So looking at just Auckland now and seeing how your consumption is going to be defined. So C40 cities was set up by the United Nations. It's a forum where they have mayors of some of these cities that aim to be at the very forefront of being sustainable. So C40 cities going there, we have Auckland there. So they released this report a couple of years ago called The Future of Urban Consumption in a 1.5 degrees Celsius world for C40 cities. So 1.5 degrees of rising, temperature rise, if you can control it to that level, what will you be eating, living, doing, Auckland? Let's have a look. So they're going to tell you how many pieces of clothing you can have, progressive targets. 8 new pieces of clothing a year, or let's bring it down even lower if you have a more ambitious target. So they talk about circular economies and so on, and there is absolutely nothing wrong in this. I love a good sport of op shopping myself, but it's being dictated to by unelected, unappointed, unaccountable globalist organizations that I have a problem with. I've done it for myself at times, right? Next 6 weeks or next 2 months, I'm not spending a penny. And this is what I'm going to do. But that's out of my own free will. No one is telling me to do that. Reducing ownership. So by 2030, they want progressively 190 vehicles per 1,000 people. Ambitious, 0 private vehicles. 16 kgs of meat per person per year. Progressive, ambitious, 0 kgs of meat. And 0 kgs of dairy.
Honestly, that's enough to protest. That's enough for me to protest.
Yeah. But again, they say, oh, no, it is just a model. And I've had enough of models in the last 3 years, enough to last me the rest of my lifetime, however long it may be. But to have these sort of figures dictated by people who I have absolutely nothing in common with, for them to decide what is good for the planet, no, thank you. These are the same ones that jet off to Davos, 400, 500 private planes land there in the rarefied atmosphere of Switzerland, or this year it was the summer Davos in China. Yeah, they are going to tell us how we are destroying the world.
Someone put in a comment, how many kilograms of crickets will be required to eat?
Free range, please.
Goal 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. And climate change is one of the core concepts of the UN and the World Economic Forum that filters through everything that they're doing, but it's specifically Goal 13, translating to setting energy consumption quotas and carbon credits, the demonization of animal agriculture, which was already touched on in other goals, penalize private vehicle ownership. Well, that'll be hard to have when we've got less oil and the price goes up. Forcing the masses onto public transport, which seems to not be that flash in Auckland. And the surveillance state will just continue to develop as these other things occur.
Yeah, and this eco-anxiety that's been pushed upon right from a very early age. I'm a very strong proponent of letting children be children while they still can, be it, their sexuality or be it climate crises and so on. Let them just focus on the basics for now, reading, writing, and so on, at least till they're 12 or 13. Childhood is fleeting. I'm seeing my own kids grow in front of my eyes. My daughter's 8.5, and God knows where that time flew. You don't want them being hammered by this, that for this, whatever brief childhood window they have. And we now have the Australia, New Zealand College of GPs now talking about training counselors in eco-anxiety. So we create the problem and then we provide a solution. We already have the worst youth suicides in OECD, or is it the second worst? What are we doing to our children, our youth? This is unconscionable, literally, for me. But again, we were the, world first legislation, first country in the world to pass a law to ensure financial organizations will disclose and act on climate-related risks and opportunities. This one passed with bipartisan support. I would, don't know, to be completely correct, David Seymour was not in Parliament that day, and he says he would have voted no, but otherwise it was unanimous. So where is our opposition? Do we even have one? And on the other hand, while they say that 1 in 5 kids are starving, hospitals are absolutely at breaking point. We have to reduce the number of beds in hospitals that are still in the works. We can pledge 19 million for climate change for wetlands in Asia. This is our money being sent overseas, being funneled overseas. Who is responsible? Who is going to ask them for an account for this? That, where has this been spent? If you're sending it to India, I can tell you it's going down a black hole or from where there is absolutely no transparency. And we seem to have it's so easy to spend other people's money. Tane, you'll have to tell me to stop. I'll go to town on this one.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I'm outraged about it as well, but just conscious of time.
Yeah.
Goal 14, to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. And this is where we've got examples of rahuis, I believe it's called, basically, limited access to fisheries. There's been issues with that in the Hauraki Gulf, as well as the example there from the Otago Daily Times.
Yep. So we are willy-nilly handing over what should actually be, public resources, under public ownership to NGOs. So the Hauraki Gulf Forum being handed over a large number of Auckland parks and reserves. And then you have rahuis being placed over for an endless amount of time. There's no end, no defined end. And DOC has been asking that the legal institutions get moving and give it legal backing to rahuis, which was, you should help me there, Tane, your ethnicity, which was otherwise just a customary process, wasn't it? It was nothing legal. It didn't have legal backing.
I don't think they have legal backing. I'm not sure though. It's
but they are pushing for it, and you've had car bans and so on, and then suddenly EV are asking that beach access, which has been stopped on certain beaches, they need to have it because, hey, it breaches the Treaty of Waitangi. So I have no words here, but this is
it all gets even more messy in New Zealand because we've got this supposed indigenous ingredient added into the complications of all the agendas they're pushing, and this is just one example of it. I mean, the foreshore and seabed issue has been something that's been a problem for
the national government.
Yeah. Goal 15, to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forest, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. So this is where we're going to get limit the access to parts of the country which already exists. There's already places you can't really go. Criminalize private land ownership, SNAs on farmland. That would be an example of this.
Yep. You have SNAs for significant natural areas where your local territorial authorities are supposed to map out. And if I can remember the exact wording, areas where highly mobile fauna may exist or is likely to exist. You just have to map those areas out. So you have the privilege of paying for them, fencing them, maintaining them, but you actually can't do anything with that. And supposedly because the government is a better steward of your land that you paid for than anybody else, we are going to have more and more of these being pushed between Indigenous Biodiversity Act, significant natural areas. We have already seen that old style wood burners, coal fuel burners, and all of this, it's going to be all for your own safety, but it is harder and harder and harder to keep them going, especially if you are not rural.
Goal 16, only one more to go. Promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Granting citizenship en masse to refugees, increasing immigration to unsustainable levels. We see that happening in Australia right now. Actually, recently, the Reserve Bank of Australia former governor, Philip Lowe, he was just slightly critical of immigration levels and how it would affect the pressure it would put on housing, and a couple of weeks later, he's been replaced. I'm not sure if that's just a coincidence or something else happened. And when you do this at an unsustainable level, it leads to issues, cultural issues, as has been recently seen in France. And maybe get into those examples, Jaspreet.
Yeah, and providing peaceful, inclusive societies. Now, inclusion, and where does this end? Where does this end? And since when did it get to be a sin to look after your own backyard first?
Yeah. The other thing that I've heard, I think it's Terry Baudet talk about, is that it's actually more cost effective to help these people in their own country in many cases. Yet the prevailing thinking is that, oh no, we need to help them here rather than at their home, which doesn't really make sense.
So we have employers calling out for workers here, and yesterday came this article by Grant Nines on interest.co.nz that more than 105,000 overseas workers have arrived in New Zealand since the beginning of the year, with 16,878 arriving just in June alone, but we are averaging 15,000 overseas workers coming in a month right now. So we already have our infrastructure at breaking point already. So where are these people going to be housed? Where are they going to find, schooling, housing, medical care, and all of this? And again, why are the people in New Zealand who are currently on different levels of social welfare, how are they being encouraged to work? That is one thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And we have seen the assimilation issues in Europe. We have seen it in Scandinavian countries. We have seen it in France more recently, where I believe it was a 17, 18-year-old who was...
it was an Algerian criminal, I think.
Yeah. And then the whole country is going up in literally a blaze. And all of these issues are going to keep happening. I mean, if you look at, and they talk about inclusive societies and peaceful institutions and justice for all. How well are we doing in the justice stakes? 17 June 2023, man who raped young girl given home detention. United Nations 2 years ago was saying that there's a high rate of Maori in prison, and that's one of the concerns for United Nations. And then our minister, Ginny Anderson, saying that, the prisons are a very bad place. But our ram raids, we've had 600 ram raids in the last few months. We have had literally sentences which are insulting to the victims. We had Canada last year, Justin Trudeau talking about the fact that finally, for once, he says a rape does not mean an automatic prison sentence. Rape will need to be accompanied by bodily harm in Canada. If a person, whosoever has committed that, is to be given more than home detention. But I thought rape was bodily harm. Sexual assault was bodily harm. But no, they have distinguished it. They have separated it. And our crime statistics are out of the gate right now. But you can't blame criminals because there's not even a slap on the wrist with a wet bus ticket. And there is no repercussions of crime. Crime is paying right now. I think the article was this morning, Tane, wasn't it, about the Auckland cake shop that's been attacked for the 4th time in 4 months?
Yes. Yeah.
So what peace, justice, and peaceful institutions are we talking of here?
Goal 17, the last one, and I think you would say is one of the most important, or the most important partnership for the SDGs. So it's all about just enhancing and expanding this spider web of network of all these non-governmental organizations and agencies and departments and governments that they're connected with and whatnot all around the world.
We think we are electing, and we don't think we elect our center government and we elect our local government representatives. And yet, to give you 2 examples, one was this afternoon, there was an article in Wanaka Times about how there's this organization, an NGO called HOW, Heart of Wanaka, which has a couple of town planners and somebody else who have created a rejuvenation plan for Wanaka City Center, taking away hundreds of car parks and so on and so forth. Now, whatever gave them this authority? There's another organization by the name of Shaping Our Future, or is it shapingyourfuture.co.nz, who have done a whole tour of Southland and Otago last year, and they followed it up this year, telling us what our future is going to look like and how city centers need to look at. What do these people think they are? Do they wake up one morning and think, yep, I need to do some good and let me go there and, start doing something? They have no business pointing, doing anything like this. Or even that Center for Sustainable Cities New Zealand, or the Australia-New Zealand Smart City Council. When have any one of us been, part of selecting these people to represent us at any level?
It's a cunning tactic. They know what they're doing. You set up these organizations that sound very official and professional and legitimate, and then they give them a fancy logo, fresh website, and start putting out recommendations and going into meetings and lobbying for their interests in all the different spaces. And I think one of the many things that we need to start doing is start doing that in reverse.
We've seen these public-private partnerships in schools, I'm sure. Inside Out, a charity that gets a big say in what the school curriculum is geared towards. We are having similarly NGOs come into schools and councils and various levels of government, farming lobby groups and so on, talking about how much needs to be done for climate, because they've got, say, that funding from NPI for $54 million for regenerative projects and so on. We have movers and shakers in organizations like Gen Less, which are pushing, carbon neutral cherries. I don't know about you, Tane, but when I last bought cherries, I didn't look about. If they were made in New Zealand, they were good enough for me. So all of that is being done by these NGOs under the guise of public-private partnerships. But what that actually does is it cuts the public out. New Zealand Steel, parent company, getting profits and billions of dollars, being given $140 million of taxpayer money. Why? How? Isn't this daylight robbery? How do you get away with stuff like this? And yet Transparency International keeps saying we are amongst the most transparent country in the world. Though in a way, in a perverse way, they are right. It's very easy to see through what's happening.
Someone put in the chat, and we'll get into some questions shortly. Alison, I think it's time for New Zealand to leave the WEF and the UN. Yeah, you're totally right, and lots of people agree with you. But we need to do a better job of getting the word out there so that there's a significant number of people out there who, if they knew what was going on, would oppose it, but they don't know what's going on. So in the first instance, our job is to help them understand.
Yeah.
And then with increased numbers, a lot of interesting things can happen from there.
Yeah. So the United Nations actually has this, or the World Bank has this public-private partnership, this whole website that collates how they're working in different countries. So we are amongst the top, I'd say, because we want to be the top scholar, don't we? Ticking off every single scorecard, every single metric that's available from the UN, and do yet another world first. It is amazing. At the end, all I'll say, it's amazing how many places we are heading along, merrily being world firsts, where other countries are just quiet. No one else is doing anything, but we seem to think, or is it because we have a overinflated sense of our importance in the world? We are tiny. Our emissions are minuscule. Tomorrow, New Zealand could just disappear, vanish from the face of the earth without a trace, and nothing would change. But we seem to think we need to be the leaders in everything: renewable energy, climate action, gender equality, you name it, that's us.